Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you who can't be here in person. It's 3 years now since I was here with the first exhibition of about 20 photo montage, as I called them. We're back again with Ralph in front of his camera making another film in which I would like to share some thoughts with you that can be illustrated by items around the walls of the room. First of all, I want to make amends for something I omitted 3 years ago, which is to acknowledge how much I owe to two contributors to that exhibition and to this one. They're called Olympus Trip 35. I'm told they have a good lens. They are light and portable and, importantly for me, easy to use. And they're identical twins, except that this one has a red tag on it to tell me that it has a colour film in it, and so this one has a black and white film, because I quite like to have the option of combining black and white and colour in the montage that I make. So there they are. It seems a bit odd to thank inanimate objects, but perhaps I should thank the person, whoever he was or she, who designed it back in the 60s or 70s. Now, this exhibition differs from the first because I've included some drawings. Portraits at one end, and some landscape at the other, or the townscape. Well, perhaps I should introduce the portraits first. On the left there is Ralph, Catherine in the middle, Matthew on the right, and between there are two of me. There are two of me, that was a choice out of a number of them, because the thing about oneself is that as a model that one is always available, and so it's easier to draw oneself in that way. The strange thing is about the series of self-portraits that I've made is that they're all very different, and as different as these two are, and that makes one wonder about likeness. We always make rather a fuss about likeness, but there are structural constants. Catherine will always have her strong cheekbones and so on. Matthew and Ralph will always have their essentially triangular faces, and well, I shall always have my ugly nose. And those are there throughout, but playing over them are moods and expressions which are notoriously difficult to capture. I think it's very hard. I mean, you can look for as long as you like at the portrait of Shakespeare in the National Portrait Gallery, but I don't think it tells you very much about what Shakespeare was like if you had been able to meet him around the streets of Southwark or somewhere. You're better off with your imagination, or with that of someone like the wonderful David Levine. Mentioning another artist makes me feel that I should confess to being a bit different from other artists in that I've devoted quite a lot of time to the study of the art of the past and different artists, not as an art historian, but in the spirit of critical inquiry and what you might call connoisseurship. And one of the things that I have discovered is that how artists draw and how they paint, or in Michelangelo's case, how they use a chisel to carve, can be very, very similar. If you take a Watteau red chalk drawing of a lady's silk dress, for example, and then look at the same dress in the paintings, the marks of chalk and brush are remarkably similar. Or if you take Van Gogh drawing and then painting the postman Roulin with his bushy beard, the stubby reed pen marks in the drawing are almost identical with the stubbly brush marks in the painting. And that happens over and over again. But if you look around this room, you could well decide that there is no connection between the drawings and the montage. And actually, I would agree with you. But I think I can explain a bit why that is. When I make montage, you're fiddling about with prints within the matrix of a grid. You can do your head in trying to find the right juxtapositions because they're potentially a great number. And that's all with your fingers and your wrists. It's quite tight work. And sometimes I long to be more gestural and more liberated. And the thing about charcoal, I mean, I'm no use with a pencil. A pencil seems to encourage tightness and fiddliness. But charcoal encourages rapid mark making. And with the rapid mark making go movement and energy, potentially. So you are working more from the shoulder, more like this. And energy, that's what I want. And in talking about energy, I have to be a bit careful. I've lived many years with Catherine, who, much of her adult life, she's suffered from chronic fatigue syndrome, which is lack of energy. Sometimes I think that she and I are like two meteorologists constantly thinking about barometric pressure and levels of energy in the atmosphere. And it's very true that if you lack energy and yearn for it, you're much more aware of energy than you are if you're lucky enough to be able to take it for granted. But of course, and so that's left me and she thinking of energy in as something to be very much desired, and a very positive thing. And of course it is. It's not just in human life, but in nature, it's the energy of life. It's the life force, the force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age, as Dylan Thomas said. So it's what we pit against entropy, the running down. It's a very wonderful thing to think about. And in nature, there is something that I've always valued as a symbol of energy. And that is the flight of swifts, swallows. Those quite small birds that make this epic journey from sub-Saharan Africa across the desert, across the Mediterranean, into Europe, and fill our skies in early summer, unfortunately in much smaller numbers now. And delight us with their incredible aerial displays. When I go to get a newspaper in the morning in May or June, and I hear that high-pitched squeak, and I look up into the blue, and I see these birds chasing around the sky like children in a playground, I think, yes, Blake was right when he said that energy is eternal delight. It is probably rather foolhardy of me to think that I can use charcoal to describe in any way the wonderful flight of these birds. swifts over the city of Palermo, but all I can say is that I have tried, and it did give me pleasure to get something of that physical movement into my drawing. I'm not really interested so much in the view as in the movement that is across it of these birds in the morning flying about. Now I want to talk about shadow. We normally think of shadow in connection with light and shadow, and that's right, because they go together. I think if I had my life over again, I would want to give more time to trying to master pen and wash, perhaps even reviving the Renaissance technique of silver point, because those two are very, very good media for conveying light and shadow. There are wonderful examples, of course, in the past. Pen and wash used by Rembrandt and surprisingly by Tiepolo and various other people, that rather interesting Welshman Thomas Jones, and right down to the great Polish artist Joseph Herman. Matthew, one year very, very generously gave me an original pen and wash drawing by him of two fishermen on a quay, and he was absolutely wonderful at pen and wash. But I want to talk about shadow almost as on its own, almost to consider it on its own. And to do that, I want to mentally take you out of this room and along the corridor to the POSK Cafe, a friendly place which I frequent most days, most mornings. I go there and to read and to write. And I like to sit by the window so that I can look up and see people passing on King Street. And if I look down the street, there's one of those tubular metal arches to which you can attach a bicycle. And if there's a bicycle there, and if it's a bright morning, the bicycle casts a shadow. The shadow, of course, reproduces the elements of the bicycle, the wheels and the handlebar and the seat, but in a strange, elongated, eccentric shape, a sort of printout on the pavement. It's rather spectral because you can't actually touch it, you'd only be touching the pavement. And it's transient too, because if the sun goes in, the bicycle is still there, but the shadow is not. It's also, you could say, entirely useless. You can ride a bicycle, but as far as I know, you can't ride the shadow of a bicycle. What can you do with it? Well, the only thing you can do, really, is to notice it, to inwardly remark on it. And you can only properly do that if you stop, if you don't walk over and through it, but stand back and look at it. If you do that, I think you're very similar to the person, perhaps yourself, walking down the street and suddenly hearing a street musician or a busker, something in the way she sings, something in the way that he plays his instrument has stopped you in your tracks. You are not sitting in a concert hall having chosen to listen to music. You're walking along on your way to Marks and Spencer, and you've been stopped, arrested by what? By an aesthetic experience of what? Perhaps the only proper term is beauty. I call this the Orpheus moment, in memory of the mythical enchanter with his lyre. Now, you can have an Orpheus moment with visual, in the visual world, just as you can with the sound, world of sound. And that, I think, is what the shadow signifies to me. It is the unexpected gift, the gratuitous loveliness of the visible world. I know, of course, that shadow has negative connotations. We can live in the shadow of suspicion or of war or of illness or death. Yes, that's true. But as an artist, I prefer to celebrate it in a more positive and benevolent light. And in fact, the first montage I ever made was of my shadow on some rocks on the Hampshire coast. And there in the corner of the room, my shadow is shadowing Catherine in that work I call Cascade, down the cascade of the years I've spent with her. And the shadow is there, and then next to it are the bicycles, actually. The bicycles in a street in Palermo, in Sicily, which is dedicated to the selling and repairing of bicycles. And there they are, lining the street up against a disused church. And I'm on a third-floor balcony looking down on a bright morning, and there are the people with their long shadows walking or cycling down the narrow street. And here is also an image of shadow. This is not a garden seat. It is the shadow of a garden seat, entirely useless. And these are not the branches of a tree in our garden. They are the shadows of the branches of a tree in our garden. And the whole image is really just the play of these shadows, which is quite dynamic. And lastly, here is the photographer with his Olympus trip, the one with the red tag. And here is Prickly Pear, the Ficadindia. And all the rest are shadows, the shadows of the Prickly Pear, the shadows of me photographing it, and in one place, Catherine standing with me. That's the contribution of shadow to this exhibition. Now I want to talk about atmosphere. I realize now that atmosphere has meant a great deal to me, consciously, unconsciously, from early childhood. And I want to share some thoughts about what it can mean. If you look it up in the dictionary, of course the first meaning is the physical envelope of the planet, which protects us, but we're doing our best to unprotect us by degrading it and polluting it and so on. But it's the second meaning that I'm concerned with, and that is more difficult to define. You may find words like mood or tone in the second definition. But it means much more to me than that. I suppose I can best approach it by saying that it is very local and specific. It is here but not there. So it occupies a certain space, and if you're sensitive to atmosphere, which not everybody is, or in varying degrees, then you feel, quite physically, almost in a tingling way, you feel that you've entered a sort of zone, a Tarkovskian zone. And the really crucial thing about atmosphere, to my mind, is that it is not just spatial, because it accrues through time. It's a sort of marriage, a sort of fusion of space and time. That's the beauty of it, that's the magic of it, and it makes it very deep and mysterious, I think, when you encounter it. And, well, perhaps I can illustrate it with one of the montage in a corner of our garden where I sense atmosphere. I mean, this is atmosphere on a very small scale. We're talking about just a few square feet, really. I'm standing with my back to this wall and trying not to trample on lilies of the valley. Now, just as energy was represented for me by the flight of swifts, atmosphere can suitably be represented by lilies of the valley. They are strange, shy plants that like to grow along the foot of a wall in ground that is left undisturbed. And over time, sometimes a lot of time, they will spread outwards into the surrounding area. In our garden, it's taken 30 years for them to colonize a very small area. And I'm aware of this atmosphere, which is definitely more than the physical presence of what I can see around me. But of course, atmosphere need not be on a small scale, it can be on a much bigger scale. And one year, Ralph took me to spend some days in Aix-en-Provence, in southern France, the town associated with Paul Cézanne. And one bright morning, hot morning, we walked east with the great massif of Mont Saint-Victoire to our left, and left the road for a lane that climbed to a sort of plateau, surrounded by all those plants of the maquis, the rock rose and stunted oak and juniper and rosemary. And then we descended into the deserted quarry where Cézanne had painted and drawn a lot. It was a magical experience for both of us. It must once have been quite a noisy place when it was a working quarry. The quarrymen shouting to each other and the horses neighing as they drew the carts away with the loaded stone. But for long, long years it's been undisturbed, and it's a crude atmosphere. Because there's nothing there but light. There's hardly much sound at all, not even the soughing of the pine trees, just the odd bird tweeting somewhere up in the canopy, and the light filtering down onto the floor of the quarry with a sort of ochreish, sandy, slightly pinkish soil. These huge rocks all around, some of them still bearing the saw marks of the quarry. cutters, and a great deal of foliage masking some of it. And it was certainly an amazing experience of atmosphere. I don't think that Cézanne, well, he was a sensitive man. He would have certainly been aware of the atmosphere, but I don't think it was his preoccupation. I think that he was concerned with finding ways to lock together into a composition the boulders and the volumes of the pine trees and the foliage and the soil and the glimpses of sky to make a composition. But that begs the question, does atmosphere exist in art? And the answer is yes, here and there. Here, but not there. If you live in London, you can find it. If you go south of the river to the picture gallery at Dulwich, and you will find there a late and very beautiful Poussin called the Roman Road. Down the center of the picture, away from the foreground, is the Roman Road with its perspective lines receding into an obviously very classical landscape. But what has happened? Poussin has been arrested, has stopped on that road at a point where there are great clumps of trees on the left that are casting a lot of shadow, a lot of shade over the road, over the lines of the road, and creating a lot of atmosphere. And the picture really records a classical landscape invaded by something that really is sort of proto-romantic, really. It's, you feel that that Keats and Coleridge and people would be at home with this. And it's definitely a picture about atmosphere. Poussin, in the 17th century, living and working in Rome and around Rome, and another great French contemporary, Claude Guillet, Claude Lorraine. He was also there with his studio where he painted his landscapes, his great landscapes. But he went out into the Roman Campagna, the area south of Rome, and he made pen and wash, beautiful pen and wash drawings. And he was acutely sensitive to atmosphere. He could feel it on the edge of woods, and then when he entered the wood, he could feel it all around him. And it was something physical, because you could feel that the atmosphere was almost, could be manifest itself physically in the presence that might suddenly appear and then disappear of a nymph or a naiad or dryad or some shy creature like a deer or stag, the great stag in the picture in the Oxford's Ashmolean. And I think of Claude, and you can't help thinking, well, he was working in Rome, and you think of Rome and the Romans. Those very practical people like the Victorians who were great civil engineers with their roads and their aqueducts. But they also had another side to them, or some of them did, which was very aware of atmosphere, the genius loci, the numen that denotes some sense, some presence of deity, of divinity. And the interesting thing is that atmosphere need not just be something experienced outdoors. You can have it indoors. because the Romans felt it in their houses. And you could have a ledge somewhere near the threshold in which you might have an oil lamp and a terracotta figurine or two, and you could pay your respects to the Lares and the Penates, and they were household tutelary spirits that, in return for your respect, would protect you and your family when you were asleep or when you were out at market. And, wow, gosh, I think that we need something of that contract and that respect now. And that's really why I needed to talk about atmosphere, because it's so important that we get rid of the controlling mindset, the exploitative, extractive, hubristic mindset, and replace it with something more respectful, more a certain reverence for something outside oneself, which is also very much inside. And I think that we are in danger of losing that. We live now in a world that seems controlled a lot by algorithms. Don't ask me about algorithms, I don't know anything about them, but I'm aware people talk about them, and I'm aware that although we've created them, they're not part of nature, but they seem to have an almost independent existence now, and a slightly sinister one, because some people think that they have contributed to our living environment all looking a bit the same. This can be demonstrated, actually. If you walk down King Street and look in estate agents' windows, you'll see photos of all these desirable residences, some of them 100 or 200 years old, but cross the threshold and you're into a world of modernity that is sometimes, in fact often, interchangeable, because they all look alike. And they're all very modern, they're very white and modern, but they are lacking in individuality and atmosphere. And I mean, I would make exceptions of some cafes and restaurants that definitely have atmosphere, but a lot of our work areas, a lot of our living rooms and kitchens and gardens do begin to look rather alike, whether you're in London or Berlin or Boston or wherever. And I think that's a shame. I think we need to recover it, mainly because of this mindset, this respectful mindset. And I think that's the message of atmosphere, really. Now I want to say something about collage. My first exhibition in this room was called Photo Montage, but I've come to realize that that's a rather clunky word for what is really just a variant of collage. What do we mean by collage? I think we have a general sense of odds and ends, bits and pieces, gathered from experience, which are put together in visual, for artists visually, on some sort of support, on paper, card, board, wood, and arranged to make some image that is more than the sum of the bits and pieces. And I don't disagree with that, but I would want to amplify it quite a lot. And I think I can get to where I want with it by thinking of it historically. Where did it begin? Photography, we know, began here in the 1840s in Laycock in Wiltshire. And after about 50 years, it spawned film. And film and photography together have utterly transformed our modern world. But they aren't that old. They're still less than 200 years old. And collage is much younger. I may be wrong, but I would place it in the 1920s, in the aftermath of the First World War. Why do I say that? Well, perhaps just briefly, I'll go back to 1815 and the Battle of Waterloo. At the end of that June day, the field of battle must have been ghastly, strewn with the corpses of soldiers and of horses. I don't want to underestimate the horror of that carnage, but about 60 miles northwest and 100 years later, the scene is utterly different. Because in that period, which is really so short, humanity has acquired the means of mass destruction. We've started to go down that terrible road. And it isn't just soldiers, professional soldiers, killed. It is now civilians and their homes and their land and a whole landscape devastated by tanks and everything else. And then within less than 20 years, another war with aerial bombardment that is capable of reducing to ruins whole swathes of towns and cities. I myself am a child of that Second World War. My father ended his life just north of Caen in Normandy, and I started my life quite close to Plymouth, both cities very badly damaged. Early memories of the gaunt ruins of a church and Nissen huts. And what all these scenes of destruction have in common is rubble. Heaps of rubble. Mountains of it. And it goes on and on. Now we have perhaps an image in our heads of children, some of them orphans, clambering about on a heap of rubble, searching for lost toys, maybe, but also scavenging for anything with which to survive. Now, with that sort of image in one's head, it can seem little short of obscene to equate any of that with poets and artists in their studies and their studios clambering about on metaphorical heaps. But there is nevertheless some sort of truth in that. The greatest collagist of all was T.S. Eliot with his Wasteland. And what is that work but the work of a man living in a shattered world and trying to find some meaning with which to redeem it by picking over a huge heap that could include, so many things, personal and collective memory, history, cities, landscapes, bits of ritual and prayer, bits of myth, bits of poetry and drama, bits of dialogue, overheard conversations, all sorts of things that he put together to make something that still seems incredibly modern. And it's modern because the sort of heap, the sort of repertoire, as it were, that he plundered to make that work, those heaps are still with us. And so Collage does have this rather tragic dimension. I would go so far as to say that it is a post-war, post-destruction, post-traumatic genre, medium. And we're still with it. We're still living with these heaps, but you can think of them in a more positive way as being a repertoire for all sorts of things, and artists can certainly feel that sense of a heap that you can find things in. And that brings me on to my last sort of theme, which is really about debt, about indebtedness, what we owe to our contemporaries, but also to people who've gone before us, the art of the past. And that can be illustrated here in this room, I'm glad to say, because one day I was walking down a street, in fact it's the continuation of the bicycle street in Palermo towards a market, and I was stopped in my tracks by an image on a wall on my left of a woman's head. It struck me as being beautifully modelled and rather remarkable. Certainly very, very different from the rather boring tag graffiti that are so ubiquitous in towns and cities. This was something different. It was clearly by a proper artist, and I stood back against the opposite wall and tried to take a photograph, not easy with cars and people passing. And then a couple of years later, in the same street, and I think the same artist made this image of a woman of colour with a colourful bandana. Then in another street, in a different part of the city, I came across a long wall painted with an abstract pattern in lovely colours. It immediately reminded me of things by Paul Klee. So I put the photos that I took of that to frame the woman's head to make this particular image, La Donna di Ballarò, the Ballarò market. On another visit, I came across these two heads of young men. I think they may be by the same artist. I don't know any of these artists. They're anonymous to me. Anyway, he's done this image, this double portrait. Well, is it a double portrait or is it one man, one young man? I look at it and I think, wow, it's familiar in one way. This is the sort of young man who's quite conscious of being handsome, having sensuous lips and watery eyes, and the sort of young man who might ride about on a motorbike with a gorgeous girl riding pillion and so on, making rather a lot of noise. But actually, when you look again, you think this is youth that is not underneath it, the bravado, very sure of itself, quite vulnerable. And there's something slippery about these heads, about the mouth and about the eyes. It makes you think there's something ambiguous, something ambivalent, that these people, or this man, it could go either of two ways. It could go to the bad or could go to the good, to being a mafioso or an anti-mafioso. And that's very universal. That's something that we all share because we all have this potential for going straight and going crooked. And that's what I like about these Palermo street artists, that they do achieve something that is universal. The first image of this white blonde woman is not, for me, a Catholic Madonna. It is just woman. And then a woman of colour. And they do remind me of, the woman of colour, that profile, it reminds you of things in Egyptian art. Of course, in Sicily, one is nearest in Europe to Africa. And in Egyptian art, you do find not just the queens, the pharaoh's wives, but ordinary women represented with this indented profile, jutting lips and chin, and very big eyes, the eye of Horus, and then the other one, and the double portrait. They can remind you of images in Pompeii, Pompeian art. But, of course, the rather sad thing is that because they're painted directly onto walls outdoors, in the salt air and so on, just weathering, they're not going to survive. And that reminds me that art actually is very mortal. It's like us. It is not going to last forever. Some of it lasts for thousands of years, and some of it can only last a few years. And this, I'm afraid, will last only a few years. But we have to remember that we talk rather glibly about immortal masterpieces and immortal genius and so on. But it's all very mortal. It won't last forever. But while it does, it can stop us in our tracks. And I think that's what these artists, rather generously in a way, feel that, well, if I can use my art to create an image that stops anybody in their tracks as it stopped me in that street, then that's something, that's good. All four of us were walking in Palermo into the Arab Quarter, and we came across two long walls at right angles, painted with a continuous frieze of figures in a strange palette of two shades of pink, two shades of blue and white, and noticeably faces that were just blank ovals with no facial features. It was Matthew who recognized that this whole frieze referred to a work called The Triumph of Death. The Triumph of Death is a subject in old art,
but he was thinking of a particular example, a huge fresco from the mid-15th century in the picture gallery of the city. This work was once in the city's main hospital at the time when plague kept on coming back, and unfortunately some of the people who saw it never came out of that building. It is a triumph of death. There is a skeletal death riding a skeletal horse. The horse's head rather reminiscent of something out of Guernica. And death is picking off mitred bishops and commoners, but it's also an image of life as well. There's a well of life, and there are musicians, and there are aristocratic ladies talking and gesticulating, and young and old men looking on. And all this is reproduced in his own way by the modern artist in what I've put around two details from the old picture. And that is the montage I call Trionfo. I'm quite pleased that this work in the room encapsulates Indebtedness. An unknown artist from London owes something to an unknown artist working in Palermo, who's contemporary, who in turn owes something to an unknown artist working in that city 500 to 600 years earlier.
All artists have egos. I wouldn't be showing an exhibition of my work if I hadn't got an ego. But it's very important that we realize that we are part of a much bigger story. Perhaps the biggest ego of all in the 20th century was that of Picasso, a great Minotaurian, some would say predatory ego, but he also was very, very aware of what he owed to others. One day, I forget which year, he was invited down into the cave at Lascaux in France to see the prehistoric cave paintings. And when he emerged, blinking into the light, he said, or is said to have said, "We have learned nothing." What he meant was, what I have just seen has never been surpassed. Arguably so. But what he did not mean was that we could not learn from what I have seen, or from a great deal else. He learned famously from African tribal sculpture, but also from medieval Spanish frescoes, from Velázquez and Goya, Raphael, the artists of his adopted France, Poussin and Ingres and Delacroix, and from his contemporary Matisse and Braque, and from the scribblings of his own son, drawing on the table at home. So we do need to bear that in mind, and I'm so moved by the fact that, I certainly owe a lot to these street artists, but they in turn, consciously or not, have somehow imbibed the art of the past, and that's why one can think of ancient art in connection with them. It's all to do with thinking of the heap, not just of rubble, but of as a repertoire. That really brings one back to collage and back to the heaps and what we can do as artists. I think that all we can hope to do really is to try to to recognize that we are part of a species that is the most creative on the planet, maybe, but also the most destructive and the most cruel. So is there anything that we can do to redeem some of that, and I think we can. It may not make much of a difference, but perhaps it's all artists can do, to make something that has a bit of meaning and a bit of beauty, if possible. And it really comes back to T.S. Eliot, who wrote that famous line, "These fragments have I shored against my ruin." My ruin is our ruin, our ruins. Ruins of Ypres, Plymouth, Caen, Dresden, Grozny, Aleppo, Mariupol, Gaza. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.